I think this is my 10th or so lecture, and let me check. Yes, every time I see more familiar faces, which is great because then I can say things and you'll remember what I said the last lecture. For example, every single note of Mozart is, yes. Well, that's not exactly the word I was going for. This gentleman said perfect, but opera. So remember, every single note of Mozart is opera. And there's no exception of that when it comes to the violin concerto. Mozart himself and his dad were exceptional string players, violin and viola. Of course, they also played keyboard at an unimaginable level of talent. They composed. Mozart ended up with more than 700 works in his short life. But what's really fascinating about the violin concertos, there are 5 of them, he wrote them all in the same 2-year span, 1773 to 1775. And that was it. Only 5 violin concertos across 2 years. And then he decided, no more violin concertos. I'm going to stick with 41 symphonies, multiple operas. But the 5th concerto is very culminating in many ways. Of the 5 concertos, it has the most moments of opportunity for the solo violinist to play a cadenza. And a cadenza is an opportunity, a moment where that soloist gets to improv a singular moment based on themes that you've already heard or predict what's to come. And our soloist this evening, the concertmaster of the DSO, Yun-Shin Song, does everything with fantastic brilliance, with creativity and execution. And the first movement of this concerto is titled Allegro aperto. And this was actually kind of an odd designation for Mozart to put in a piece symphonically oriented. He only used that designation, aperto, a few times with his orchestral pieces, and they were all with concertos. 2 of the piano concertos, the oboe concerto. Otherwise, he only used those words together like that in his operas. And overall, what it meant was this music is to be played with a sense of majestic nuance, a quality of royalty, perhaps. Has anyone heard The Marriage of Figaro? So, when we have royalty in Mozart operas, they get their aria. Those characters in the opera get at least one aria. And it's always prefaced by an accompanied recit, and then it goes into a very loving passage of cantabile, very lyrical music. And the second movement of the concerto tonight, when we're doing it, I want you to imagine that it's actually the Countess. And she's singing about, oh, I wish the Count loved me, or, oh, I wish, Carabino would stop being all over me, that sort of thing, okay? So that's your second movement. And then we get to the third movement. And this is a fantastic moment. It's the first time that Mozart actually writes col legno in one of his works, and it wouldn't be the last time either. Col legno is when a string player takes their bow, and instead of using the side that has hair on it, they use the other side and strike it against the string. It produces a percussion-like sound, almost like, knock on wood. And this had always been associated with military sounds. That's how this concerto ended up with the nickname the Turkish Concerto. It has similarities with some of Mozart's later Turkish music, like the, Rondo alla Turca. Later within that movement, there are Turkish qualities. And then, of course, later he would write one of his only 2 operas originally in German, The Abduction from the Seraglio, and that also had Turkish influence. So, as I mentioned, this isn't the first time that col legno is used in a symphonic setting. So first, I'd like you to hear what we're going to do tonight. So this is the col legno moment. And can you kind of associate a warlike quality to it? And so this piece, actually, this next one, is by Heinrich Bieber, and it's called Battaglia, as in, battle, and it's from 1673. Could you hear it there as well? What was that? No, that's Heinrich Bieber. That's a composer from the 17th century. That piece is actually 1673. And so all three of these movements have aspects of opera to them. So you're going to remember that we're going to hear the Countess in the second movement, and we're going to think during the third movement about a Turkish military. And then Mozart, being Viennese, of course, or from Austria in that area of the world at the time, had his fair share of thoughts about Turkish military. Since 1690, Vienna and the Turkish military would fight each other. They'd take turns losing, they'd take turns winning. And of course, their sounds from their respective militaries would influence each other. But of course, like Mozart, Mahler was also composing in Austria and Vienna. And when it comes to deciphering a Mahler symphony, it's really hard to know where to start. This symphony this evening is 70 minutes long. And when you open the score, it's a little bit cruel. The very first measure of the entire symphony, just one player, just solo trumpet. And the amount of information that Mahler provides in that one measure of music lets you know that for the next 70 minutes worth of music, you're gonna have to make decisions about style, articulation, execution, flow, phrasing, balance, orchestration. And as much as he gives you to decipher what's going on, no performance can ever be duplicated. As conductors, when we grapple with the song cycles or the symphonies of Mahler, we always know two things. He always operated in extremes. And when you're on the podium, there are two conductors there, yourself and Mahler. He was a hugely successful conductor. In 1901 and 1902, during those summers when he wrote this symphony, he couldn't do it during the actual season of the opera because he had an incredibly active conducting schedule. In just 10 years, he had over 645 performances of operas. And when you go back in time and you look at his season of 1901, how many performances just in January of that year he had, of course, he only wrote 9 symphonies, 10, and a few song cycles in his lifetime because he didn't have the time to write more. Every summer, he would go to his hut in Meijernig, and this is true, he would have kittens in his pockets, and he would compose. And so this symphony this evening is actually written across 2 summers. And it's very, very biographical how this is put together. In the summer of 1901, Mahler had just survived a very, very, very scary illness. He almost died. And while that may not directly have influenced the terror, rage, anger, angst of the first 2 movements of the symphony, you could argue that perhaps that's the case. 70 minutes of music, 5 movements, but he does give us a little favor. He gives us a little hint of how to go through this. The work is divided into 3 parts. The first 2 movements go together, almost like one movement. And then the third movement is its own entity. And then the 4th and 5th movements go in tandem. So I'm just going to establish this now. Of the 3 parts, the first one, it's all stormy. It's all anger and death. The second part, it's actually dance music, but not in a traditional, happy, nor necessarily fully Viennese sense. And then the third part, movements 4 and 5, are entirely focused on joy and love. Mahler was educated in Vienna and had many influences of composers before him. This was his 5th symphony, but you can hear the influences of Brahms and Beethoven and even music from farther back in his earlier works. The first movement of Mahler, it references Beethoven 4. The famous trombone solo that opens Mahler 3 bom, 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 sorry for singing, is actually a minor version of the finale from Brahms 1. Ba, da, 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 da. I'll let them know that we want that as an encore, okay? Well done. But also, there's a Dies Irae theme, but not in the way that you expect. So one thing that you can always count on with Mahler is that he's extreme and that he's always going to do two things at the same time. There's always two things happening. Somehow his music will simultaneously be slow and fast, loud and soft, huge and small. And he uses the Dies Irae theme in his second movement not to celebrate death, really. So listen to this. So that's the overall contour of the Dies Irae. So this is how he chooses to orchestrate that in the second movement. So, like I said, the first part, the first two movements, are all Sturm und Drang. They're all chaotic, they're full of rage. And even in the most major moment, the most climactic, major, perhaps sunny, joyful time, in the first 25 minutes of the symphony, it's still referencing death in a way. So that same climactic moment comes back in the fifth movement. But it's absolutely transformed. While it's the same overall music, this time it's missing something very important. So now we have the same music, but he's removed the reference to death. So what makes this symphony really properly a dark to light symphony as opposed to Beethoven 5 or Beethoven 9 is that there's really no sense of apotheosis until the very end of the piece. Even in Beethoven 5, you get the very angsty Allegro con brio first movement, but then you still get a second movement in major. Or like the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, yes, it's very dark in the first movement, but the third movement still has a lot of aspects of major overall joyous qualities. With Mahler's Fifth Symphony, you don't get it until 68 minutes of music have passed. And then you finally get a properly major moment utilizing the whole orchestra with no veiled references to death. And for Mahler, this is a pretty intense moment. For the four symphonies before the fifth, he always used some type of literary inspiration. When he was a kid, actually, he didn't know that he wanted to be a composer or a performer or a musician. He really wanted to be a poet. So words were always a part of his life. His first symphony is reference after reference to a song cycle of his. The second symphony, two female soloists and a full choir. The monstrous third symphony, full choir, soloist, and a kids' choir. The fourth symphony, in the finale, a solo voice. So it's a very conscious decision that he removes words and text from the Fifth Symphony, and then the same thing for the Sixth, and the same thing for the Seventh. However, there is two small literary aspects to this symphony. One is quite sad. He had also been working on his Kindertotenlieder, songs on the death of children. When you ask conductors, what do you love about Mahler? Usually their expression is, all of it, everything. But what he really does in every note is he inputs an aspect of humanity. So in 1901, it was not strange for someone's child to die, unfortunately. And the other thing about Mahler is, while he simultaneously had the past, somehow he had elements of the future, almost prophetic in a way. He was amongst the genius elite in Vienna at the time who felt World War I coming. And so the unfortunate thing about writing Kindertoten later in 1901 was that later one of his children would die, his daughter, which would go on to inspire Alban Berg's Violin Concerto. And so the mother of that child is the second literary source of inspiration for this symphony, Alma Schindler, who became Alma Mahler. Alma was known throughout Vienna as the most beautiful woman in town. She was stunning, she was brilliant, and Mahler fell in love, and unfortunately he was quite condescending to her, and she wanted to compose, he discouraged it. But for a period of time, they were very, very happy. Before they became married, he wrote her a letter, but it wasn't with words. It was actually the fourth movement of this symphony, the Adagietto. Purportedly, William Mengelberg, a Dutch conductor who worked on a lot of Mahler's pieces, has confirmed this story that after seeing the pages, Mahler sent the pages to where she was, and all she said afterward was, "Please come. Sollen kommen. He should come." And in 1902, they were married. It was pretty quick. And so what happens with a work like the Adagietto that's so famous and so well known is it has the tendency to become manipulated over time. And when Mahler did this piece, it took him 7 minutes. 7 minutes for this movement. And for reference, there are plenty of conductors now who do this movement in about 15 minutes. And so it's very important to know the background of a piece because it influences how you do it. So if you do this movement really, really slow, it retains too much of part one. It retains too much of that idea of death and angst and pain, when actually it needs to flow because it's a love letter. It's a love song in a way. And also, if you linger on the first three measures of it, that's like, you know how in Romeo and Juliet, how he talks about Rosalind, and if Romeo talks too much about Rosalind, then what's he supposed to say for Juliet later? You can't give it all away in the first few bars. It's like saying, "Dear Alma," and then deciding that that's the most important part of the letter. So it needs to flow. And another thing about making it flow is Mahler instructs us to go straight from the fourth movement directly into the fifth movement. And so if you take 15 minutes to get through the fourth movement, your 70-minute symphony is looking longer and longer and longer, and your players get more and more tired. Brilliantly, Mahler composed his pieces. An aspect of his composition that's so particular is how he orchestrates his works. And that means which instruments he chooses at what time to play what. In the first few bars of the symphony tonight, it's solo trumpet. And then suddenly this huge chord and another huge chord, and you think the stage just erupted. That hurricane from yesterday, it's here, surprise, but that's actually not what's happening. Even though it sounds like he's used the entire orchestra right up front, he's not used half the wind players. And you'll have climax after climax throughout the work. And you don't know it. It's subconsciously happening, but he's saving all of those instruments until the real climax of part one, about 14 minutes into the piece. Mahler, as a composer, was able to influence our idea of the symphony and our idea of how we create music. While we had talked earlier about, he references Beethoven and Brahms and Gregorian chant, he influenced people after him to compose in a way that he did, providing so much detail and direction. When you look at the symphony, when you get to the fifth movement, over and over and over, he says things to the conductor. Don't slow down. And you realize he's put it in a place where you really want to slow down. And then he's put another marking 24 bars later, don't speed up. And you realize, oh, but I want to speed up. It's because he knew our tendencies. He was such a great musician that he anticipated what the conductors after him would do. Famously, about the third movement of this symphony, he said, for the next 50 years, conductors will ruin it. I promise that's not the case tonight. Raphael is an unbelievable conductor, and the DSO plays this music at a world-class level. The third movement, which we kind of skipped over, has those qualities of Viennese life that Mahler experienced, but in a folk-like way. So there are two types of dances happening. There's a waltz, which is more of a courtly three dance, and then a Ländler, which is more of a rustic folk dance. In Vienna, the Viennese are very proud of how their rhythms for dance are not actually decipherable. You can't really write them down in the exact way. You print a normal rhythm and then you say, à la Viennese, and you're supposed to know what that means. In the first 4 measures of the third movement, you get solo horn, and once again, you get a tempo, retard, accelerando, a tempo, and tempo 1. All of that information, and it's just for one player. Our solo horn tonight, he's unreal. His talent, his musicianship, it's fantastic. And what happens is, not only do you have dances, rustic outdoor dances in the third movement, you also get alpine horn calls. And you're going to hear all the horns in the back repeat these notes. And when that starts to happen, try to hear from where it's coming. Because ideally, you're supposed to be in the effect of these sounds bouncing off mountains within the Alps. It's all outdoor music. And so when you go from the third movement, that's outdoorsy, it's folk, it's in nature, it's in the mountains, you're supposed to dance, you're supposed to move. And then you go to the intimate fourth movement, you have to go back inside. You can choose where you go, into Mahler's composition hut, or you can think about if you could write a love letter, would you use music or not? Who would you give it to? I've never gotten one, but that's okay. And then once the fifth movement happens, if you know the other 8 symphonies, you realize that in tandem, the fourth and fifth movements create probably the longest stretch of compositioned joy that Mahler ever created. He wasn't particularly a happy fellow. He died in 1911. He was only 51 years old, 1860 to 1911, and during his life, he had a lot of hardships. Some of these would be predicted in his works, like in the fifth and sixth symphonies. And then, if anyone has time later to go home and listen to the ninth symphony, you might even decide that the opening rhythm of that symphony is Mahler predicting his own heart failure, that he didn't have a stable heartbeat. And so all of this lecture is to say that tonight you're going to go through a whole lot of extremes, extreme emotions, extreme aural changes. He goes from using 105 players to 2 in the span of measures. There will be moments of sheer terror, implementing the battery of percussionists that we have, and then a phrase later, we're back outside, waltzing. So I only have a couple minutes left, and I always want to make sure to leave time to answer any questions that anyone might have before the concert tonight. Now's the time. Yes? Can I say anything more about kittens and pockets? There's a book by Norman Lebrecht called Why Mahler, and he talks a lot about the kittens and the pockets. And so you could check that out if you'd like to know more. Are there any other questions? Usually you guys have more questions for me.
We're all getting ready to listen and absorb all the information you just gave us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, enjoy the concert tonight, everyone.